The chaos of the 2020s did not begin with a war or a pandemic or a global supply chain collapse. It began with a map, a quiet, forgotten map, drawn more than a century ago by a man who saw the world differently from everyone around him. When the rest of the world saw borders, he saw patterns. When nations argued over ideologies, he traced lines of land, mountains, and frozen plains. And when the world believed peace would last forever, he saw the storm forming. The first signs were small: a strange tremor in global markets, a sudden military buildup in places most people couldn't find without Google Maps. But slowly, as the 20s rolled forward, the tremors became earthquakes. Borders turned into battlefields. Energy routes that once felt indestructible suddenly snapped like thin wires. And every time the world paused in shock, Mackinder's old warning echoed louder. In 1916, Halford Mackinder introduced an idea so radical that even military leaders didn't know what to make of it. While nations were losing millions of lives in the First World War, Mackinder wasn't looking at battles. He was looking at the Earth itself, at the curves of the continents, at the harsh geography across Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, at a region so massive, so protected, and so strategically placed that he believed it held the key to world power. He called it the Heartland. To most people at the time, it was just a wilderness of snow and endless plains, a place too cold, too empty, too far away to matter. To Mackinder, it was the hinge of history, the land empire that could dominate the entire world if the right force ever took control of it. He summed it up in one sentence, a sentence the world brushed aside, a sentence that feels like a prophecy now. Who rules Eastern Europe commands the Heartland. Who rules the Heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. But back then, people didn't want to believe it. They were comfortable with the idea that oceans were the source of power, that ships controlled trade and trade controlled influence. And for a while, that was true. The British Empire ruled the seas. The United States became an ocean power. Naval strength seemed more important than any frozen landlocked region. So leaders dismissed Mackinder's theory as academic imagination, clever maybe, but irrelevant. But history did not dismiss it. Every major conflict of the 20th century drifted back toward the Heartland as if pulled by gravity. Hitler's invasion of Eastern Europe, the Soviet expansion across Eurasia, the Cold War battle lines, all of them aligned with the territory Mackinder had circled on his map. And yet, once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the world breathed a sigh of relief. People thought Mackinder's old theory had finally died. The Heartland was broken, Russia was weakened, new democracies formed. Globalization spread like sunlight over the continent. Technology made oceans feel small. Airplanes made distance feel meaningless. Everyone said the same thing: geography was no longer destiny. But geography doesn't disappear just because we stop looking at it. The 20s exposed this illusion in the harshest way possible. Energy shortages spread like shockwaves. Wars erupted in places most people assumed were stable. Economic alliances fractured overnight. For the first time in a generation, people felt the world shrink. Not through technology, but through tension. And slowly, unwillingly, the world realized Mackinder had never been wrong, only forgotten. The Heartland was waking up. But this awakening didn't begin with tanks or missiles. It began with pipelines, railways, and influence. Agreements carved in boardrooms, silent expansions of power, new strategic partnerships stretching across thousands of miles. While the rest of the world obsessed over technology, currencies, and social media wars, the Heartland was being rewired, piece by piece, into the kind of power block Mackinder feared most. And while countries argued on television about culture, elections, and ideology, something deeper, something older, was happening beneath them. The old map was re-emerging. The geography that shaped the ancient empires was shaping the modern world all over again. The frightening part? No one noticed until it was too late. The early 20s felt chaotic because the world finally collided with Mackinder's forgotten truth. If the Heartland rises, the world trembles, not through sudden collapse, but through a slow tightening, a supply chain here, a border conflict there, a winter too cold, a summer too dry. Pressure building silently until even distant nations felt the squeeze. But the question that haunts experts today isn't whether Mackinder was right. The question is why his theory is exploding back into relevance now, a century later. Why this decade? Why this moment? What changed in our world to make an old geopolitical prophecy come alive with terrifying accuracy? The answer lies in a part of his theory most people never read. The part that explains how the Heartland grows, how it spreads, and why the world always ignores it until the breaking point. The misunderstanding that shaped the modern world came from a single assumption: that technology had defeated geography, that planes, satellites, global banks, and digital maps had erased the old rules of power. Leaders believed the world was flat now, tightly connected, borderless, predictable, but Mackinder never agreed. He believed that no matter how advanced the world became, the Earth's physical shape would always pull the strings. And in the 20s, that pull became impossible to ignore. To understand the chaos of our current decade, imagine the Heartland not as a country, but as a vast pressure zone, a knot in the center of the Earth's landmass. When calm, the knot stays tight, and the world enjoys long periods of predictable prosperity. But when disturbed, when pulled by ambition or desperation, the knot strains and tightens, and the tension radiates outward into Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. This is exactly what began to happen as the 20s unfolded. The early signs were subtle: quiet negotiations between powerful landlocked nations, new infrastructure stretching across deserts and mountains, alliances forming with little fanfare, all of it unnoticed by the global public, yet all of it moving in one direction, consolidating power inside the Heartland. Mackinder would have recognized it instantly. This was the first stage of his prophecy, the stitching of the Heartland. For centuries, the Heartland was too fragmented to act as one force. Tribes, kingdoms, empires, all competing, all divided by terrain. But slowly, through a mix of ambition, necessity, and geopolitical pressure, the region began to unify economically and strategically. Roads turned into railways, railways turned into corridors, energy corridors turned into political leverage. The Heartland was beginning to breathe again, and with every new connection, every pipeline, every trade route, the region became more cohesive, more capable, more influential. Inch by inch, the old fortress Mackinder described was reforging itself into a modern power network. Yet the world continued looking elsewhere. People obsessed over cultural battles, social media trends, elections, and stock markets. Meanwhile, the map was shifting under their feet like tectonic plates preparing for a quake. Then the first tremors hit. Conflicts erupted on the Heartland's edges, not randomly, but exactly where Mackinder had drawn his fault lines, the areas he called the Rimland. The coastal territories surrounding the Heartland became flashpoints again. Nations found themselves caught between competing forces, pressured to choose sides in a struggle they barely understood. Energy crises rippled across Europe. Trade routes stalled, borders hardened, and suddenly the comfort of globalization collapsed like a fragile bridge under too much weight. But the real shock wasn't the conflict itself. It was the speed. Systems that took decades to build fell apart in months. The global economy, once the symbol of stability, proved vulnerable to a single blockade or a single pipeline failure. Nations discovered that their food, their electricity, their medicine, everything they depended on, was linked to the heartland in ways they never realized. Mackinder predicted this too. He warned that once the heartland began to unify, the rest of the world would feel the consequences like aftershocks from an earthquake. Every disruption inside the region would send tremors outward, destabilizing even the most peaceful nations. But here's where the prophecy becomes even more unsettling. Mackinder didn't believe the heartland would expand through brute force alone. He believed it would expand through gravitational pull, drawing nations into its orbit with resources, partnerships, energy, and strategic necessity. A form of influence that didn't look like conquest, but functioned exactly like it. This is what the 20s exposed. Countries starving for fuel, technology, or trade opportunities began leaning toward the heartland, not out of loyalty, but out of survival. While traditional superpowers argued among themselves, the heartland strategically built connections, economic strings that turned into political ropes, and with each new rope, the global balance of power tilted further. This is why the 20s feel like a decade of rapid, disorienting change. Because we are not dealing with isolated crises. We are dealing with the re-emergence of the world's oldest geopolitical force, the one Mackinder believed could reshape civilization itself. But perhaps the most eerie part of his theory is this. Mackinder believed the West would ignore the signs until the heartland was fully awakened. Not because of arrogance, but because of belief. Belief in technology, in naval power, belief in the idea that globalization made geography irrelevant. In other words, he predicted our blind spot, and he warned that once the world finally recognized the heartland's rise, it would already be too late to stop the consequences. Now, the 20s are revealing those consequences one by one. Trade shocks, resource shortages, global inflation, shifting alliances, military escalation, cyber warfare, global competition for rare minerals. Everything that feels chaotic today is part of a larger pattern Mackinder outlined in 1916. But the most disturbing part, the part of his theory that leaders feared the most, is still ahead. Because Mackinder did not believe the rise of the heartland was the climax. He believed it was only the beginning, the first in a chain reaction that would reshape the entire world order. And in the next chapter, we uncover that chain reaction. We explore the final stage of Mackinder's prophecy, the stage he believed would define history, the stage where nations make desperate choices, the stage where misunderstandings trigger global consequences that no one can control. The most unsettling part of Mackinder's theory isn't what already happened, it's what he believed would come after the heartland awakens. Because Mackinder never saw his warning as a prediction of war, he saw it as a prediction of miscalculation, a period when nations, blinded by outdated beliefs, misunderstand the speed and scale of the changes unfolding beneath them. He feared a world where leaders reacted too slowly, trusted the wrong assumptions, and made choices based not on reality, but on the world they wished still existed. As the 20s unfold, it feels like we're living inside that exact mistake. Governments keep preparing for yesterday's threats, while tomorrow's threats grow in silence. Diplomats talk about cooperation, while alliances fracture. Economies are built on systems that can crumble with a single disruption. And ordinary people, watching the news at night, feel the instability even if they don't fully understand it. A quiet sense that the world is shifting under their feet. This is the essence of Mackinder's final prophecy. He believed that once the heartland rebuilt its power, the global balance would enter a fragile phase, a phase he described as a pivot age, a moment when history swings sharply in one direction or another, reshaping the destiny of nations for generations. The kind of moment where one decision, one border dispute, one political misstep could ignite consequences that spiral far beyond anyone's control. And disturbingly, we've seen signs of this spiral already. Conflicts erupt in regions long considered stable. Sanctions ripple across continents like shockwaves. Energy routes turn into battlegrounds. Food and resource shortages flare in distant countries. A drought in one region triggers unrest in another. A blockade on one side of the world causes factory shutdowns on the other. These aren't isolated incidents. They are reactions within a tightly wound system, one that Mackinder believed would become dangerously sensitive once the Heartland became strong enough to influence global flows of power. But Mackinder's final warning went deeper. He believed that the greatest danger would come not from the Heartland's strength, but from the desperation of those losing influence. As land power expands, sea power contracts. Traditional global powers, especially those depending on oceans and trade routes, begin to feel cornered. And when nations feel cornered, they don't act rationally. They act emotionally, urgently, sometimes recklessly. This is the stage Mackinder feared most, a stage where misunderstanding becomes more dangerous than hostility. A stage where a misread signal, a failed negotiation, or a symbolic act can set off a chain reaction none of the players intended. Because Mackinder understood something the world keeps forgetting. Global power transitions are almost never peaceful. History shows that when one power rises and another declines, conflict, in some form, almost always follows. Not necessarily through armies, but through economic warfare, political pressure, cyber attacks, proxy conflicts, disinformation, and technological competition. 1,000 small cuts leading to a single breaking point. And today, the breaking points are multiplying. For the first time in decades, countries are no longer confident about their allies. Regions once considered stable now feel unpredictable. Nations are quietly building stockpiles, diversifying energy routes, and preparing for futures they don't openly discuss. Leaders avoid answering simple questions about the global order because even they can feel the ground moving. The terrifying thing is that Mackinder predicted this too. He warned that once the Heartland reached full cohesion, the struggle for influence wouldn't just reshape borders, it would reshape civilization. It would force countries to choose sides not based on ideology, but on geography and survival. Lines would be drawn across continents, not because nations want it, but because the structure of the earth demands it. And this is where his theory becomes prophetic. Mackinder believed that as the Heartland grows stronger, the world will move into an era of competition masked as cooperation. Nations will speak of peace while preparing for conflict. They will negotiate trade deals while building walls. They will talk about unity while quietly redrawing spheres of influence. Everyone will sense the shift, but no one will admit it until it's too late. Look around today. That's exactly what's happening. Competing powers sign agreements that fall apart within months. Global organizations struggle to maintain authority. Military exercises grow larger, closer, and more symbolic. Countries invest heavily in space, cyber war, artificial intelligence, and rare minerals, because deep down, governments know the truth Mackinder tried to warn them about. The world is entering a new contest for the center of the map. Not a contest for ideology, not a contest for culture, but a contest for strategic survival. A contest shaped entirely by geography, the same geography that shaped every empire before us. And this is where Mackinder's theory ends, and our reality begins, because Mackinder never lived to see the 2020s. He never saw the global tensions, technological revolutions, energy dependence, digital vulnerabilities, and climate pressures that now amplify every shift in power. He never saw a world where a supply chain disruption could destabilize economies or where cyber attacks could cripple a nation overnight. But he didn't need to. His maps had already revealed a pattern repeating now with almost frightening precision. A rising heartland, a world split into competing spheres, a fragile global system stretched to its limits. Nations preparing for futures they no longer trust. A pivot age unfolding in real time. And if Mackinder was right about all of this, then he may also be right about what comes next. Because according to his theory, the final stage of global transformation begins when the struggle for the heartland becomes the struggle for the entire world. A struggle that reshapes alliances, redraws borders, and forces civilizations to confront the limits of their power. A struggle we may already be stepping into, one quiet, unsettling moment at a time.